Good evening. Welcome to the February 11th, 2025 meeting of the Carrboro Town Council. This is a work session tonight and not a regular business meeting. There will be no formal action taken at this meeting and no votes. We will be discussing one item. And at this time, I will have Town Manager Tony to say just a brief introduction about that item. And welcome, Bob Hornick.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. Tonight, we will review our process for our land use ordinance rewrite. You'll notice the name is Unified Development Ordinance. I think that is pretty much of a standard. Most communities use UDO versus LUO. And so that is an update to what we call it. This is an opportunity to hear from our consultant, timeline, engagement, and then if you all have some questions, and make sure we're on the right path of what you all would like to see in terms of the LUO for this work session. So Christina Moon will, from our planning department, our interim planning director, will introduce the consultant. So Tina.
Great, thank you. First off, thank you everyone for this opportunity to talk about this important topic again. While I introduce Chad Meadows and Karen Malo, also from the team, and while Chad is making his way up to the podium, I just also wanted to alert you that our new social pinpoint site is up and running. And so there's an opportunity after the meeting for you to take a look at this along with the downtown area plan and other projects. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. And with that, I will turn it over to Chad.
Thanks, Tina. Good evening. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. How are you? I'm Chad Meadows with CodeRight. We spoke last month, so I hope everybody is well. It's wonderful to be back in front of you guys. Can everybody hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. As was mentioned, we're here tonight. Thank you for the time. We'd like to do a couple of things with you guys tonight. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the project status, what we've heard up to this point, a quick refresher for you on the project pillars, the 4 or 5 topics that are really guiding our work on the project. We're excited to tell you about the public forum that's coming up later this month and get some thoughts, if you guys have any, about that effort. We'll also talk a little bit about legislation and compliance. We've built some time into tonight's discussion for give and take, question and answer at the end of the process. And by all means, if a question comes up or you'd like to have some discussion about a topic along the way, please don't hesitate to stop me. We did build in time at the back end, and it's very easy for us to rotate slides around as needed if we need to go back and look at some other slides. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Obviously, tonight we want to talk about our progress. And we'd like to hear y'all's thoughts about the project, things that we need to cover, things that you want to be sure that we think about as we move forward, okay? All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about project status. The wheel that you see on the screen has 10 tasks. This is about a 19-month project. We are just about done with the first task, project initiation. So that included a variety of things. We've done 10 introductory meetings with various staff departments, with development community, with others. We did a series of 9 interviews. 5 of those were with you. So we've had a chance to speak to about 23 folks thus far. It's a good start. Got a lot more to do. We certainly recognize that. As Tina mentioned, the Social Pinpoint site has been launched and is now active. We have also received the preliminary draft market analysis from Knoll Consulting Group. They are our market economists. They're focusing on market demand, what is the development potential for Carrboro, and how do we go about absorbing the market demand that exists, not just now, but in the out years. So we've gotten the first run of that. We're still reviewing that internally, and as soon as that's done, we'll release that to the public so that everybody can have a look at that. So this is kind of where we are. I would say that we're a couple of weeks behind, but I think that we will plan on having the diagnosis wrapped up in March. So moving forward nicely. I'll also comment, I find your staff to be very, very diligent, very, very hardworking, and very, very helpful. They've kept us on track. They've pointed out issues of concern for us as we've moved forward, and they've been a wonderful group of people to work with. So I thank you for that. I mentioned before, we've had a series of meetings, 10 with staff, manager, attorney's office, planning staff, all of the department heads, et cetera. So we've had a nice broad brush review of issues and people's concerns about the development regulations. We had a special meeting with the development community. I think there were about 40 or so folks who were invited. We had around 15 show up. 12 of them were there at the beginning, and we were able to get their names and so forth. Several other people kind of came and went through the course of the meeting. But they had a lot of good feedback for us, which is summarized in the development community meeting summary, which as soon as staff is acceptable with that, we're going to release that for everybody to review. That's a really, really interesting document to have a look at it. So we encourage you to take a look at that when it comes out. Also, the stakeholder meetings, the interested party discussions we had with you and we had with about 15 or 16 other folks from the community who gave us a bunch of information that we've organized into topics like density and housing and what makes Carrboro great. What sort of things should we be looking at for the downtown? What about the development review process itself? So we've heard lots and lots of good information. It's summarized in these 3 reports that you see pictures of on the screen. We hope to post those on the webpage soon so that people can digest those and be inspired to get involved and share more information with us. As I mentioned, it's a good start. We know there's more to do. One of the things that we did ask for during these interested party interviews is who else should we be speaking with? And so we've got, I think, probably at least one more round of meetings or meeting with individuals who want to talk to us about the project. So that's exciting. I'm happy to say that most of the input that we've received aligns with the policy guidance, whether that's Carrboro Connects or other policy documents that you guys have adopted. Some comments raised some interesting questions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. There are obviously difference of opinion here in the community, which is normal and typical, and something that we need to continue to explore, study, and incorporate in what we're preparing. So we'll use some input from the input that you guys give us tonight, plus what we hear from the public forum in a couple of weeks. And the co-diagnosis, which is the next sort of step in the process to really frame the discussion for the community about how we move forward with the UDO, okay? So that is our input to date. Before I talk about the project pillars, a couple of comments about context. There's 2 different sort of aspects or sides of land use control in any local government. And the first side is sort of the policy guidance side, right? That's your comprehensive plan, your small area plans, the policy guidance that relates to land use that this council adopts based on community input. So obviously, first and foremost for us in the UDO project is Carrboro Connects, right? And so that document sets out the shared vision for the future. It lists the actions that are necessary to achieve that vision of the future. And it includes a future land use map. Think about the future land use map as sort of the where do we take the actions that we've identified in the policy document itself. So 2 aspects of policy guidance. This drives the implementation side of the equation, okay? Policy guidance is advisory It's based on community input. It's aspirational, okay? You guys work with the community to figure out who do we want to be when we grow up, how do we get there, and where do we put the things on the ground to make that happen. That's policy guidance. That leads to the implementation side of the spectrum. The implementation, in this instance, is your land use ordinance, or, in this case, your unified development ordinance. That's not aspirational. That's the law. Okay, this is a legal document. It carries the weight of law, and it's required to be followed. Okay? Now, in addition to the text, which is this unified development ordinance text, there is also a zoning map, okay, which bears a lot of resemblance to the future land use map, and it's really, really important to understand the distinctions between the two. The future land use map is aspirational classifications of the kinds of things that we'd like to see on the ground in the future. It is a suggestion. It is not the law. Zoning map, on the other hand, is the law. These are the ranges of allowable uses and the dimensional standards that go with them and the places where you can establish the use that's permitted under the UDO, okay? So understand that there are some significant differences there, and terminology is really, really important. When you talk about land use maps, that's typically within the lexicon of policy guidance. When you talk about zoning maps, that's the stuff that relates to implementation in the UDO, okay? And I say this because we've had some conversations and there were some questions about the land use map, and I think I probably gave the wrong answer because I thought you were talking about the future land use map, when I think that the intention was to talk about the zoning map. And so I wanted to share that with you so that you knew what was going into my brain when you say the word land use map. That means something different than zoning map. Zoning is zoning districts and it's law. Land use is aspirational classifications. The last point I want to make on this is you know, the UDO, your current LUO, that deals with land use, densities, dimensional standards, kinds of site configuration features. All of that stuff is really, really, really important, okay? But much of what is in Carrboro Connects doesn't have anything to do with land use, right? There's a lot about funding. There's a lot about coordination with other agencies, programs that the town wants to undertake, education, things that you'd like to provide to the people who live here about how things work or the situation that we're in, okay? There's also, just to make things even extra confusing, there's a whole nother document out there called your Town Code of Ordinances, okay, which deals with things like police, parking, your cable franchise agreements, et cetera, the public streets, et cetera. That's your town code. That's not your land use ordinance, okay? So we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about this. I just want to set the frame for you so that you understand that there's policy guidance and then there's implementation. Implementation is your UDO and your zoning map. Your plan also has other things, important things in it that are great and that you need to pursue that don't have anything to do with the zoning map or the UDO, okay? All right. So the project pillars, we talked about this. I was before you guys back in November, and one of the things that we set out at that time was this slide, that we think there are 4 sort of project pillars, and basically what we mean by that are, you know, these are areas of importance, areas of focus: climate action, race and equity, attainable housing, predictable development review processes. These are parts of the UDO project that we're going to focus on, and they contain a variety of different aspects within each of them. And I'm going to talk about each one in a minute. Okay, but before I do, I would like to mention to you that there might be a 5th pillar. As we've heard from the community, as we've dove into your policy guidance, and we've started to look at your development regulations, it's occurred to us that community character, the things that make Carrboro special, the things that make Carrboro recognizable for the people in this community, is also a pillar of importance that we need to focus on. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and this colors or flavors our work that we'll be doing on your UDO. We will be looking at embracing and trying to reconcile community character along with these other 4 important aspects, okay? One more thing I want to mention. The ideas that are embedded or that are behind or that support these pillars, they're not mutually exclusive. They overlap with one another. In some cases, there's great alignment in that overlap. In some cases, there's not. There's a little bit of divergence here, and I'll highlight some of that for you in a moment. We're not here to reopen the comprehensive plan, but I wanted to point out that issue for you guys, that there are some aspects that we're going to need to have more discussion with the community on, with you guys on, with staff on, particularly in those areas of divergence in these ideas that sort of support these pillars, okay? That's normal. It's to be expected. And it's something that's going to, guide our questions as we move through the process, okay? All right, so I'm going to start with the first pillar, which is climate action. Okay. So policy guidance tells us that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's really, really important. I believe the comp plan says by 80% in the out year. But not just greenhouse gas emission reduction. We also want to conserve ecosystems, wetlands, native species, environmentally sensitive areas. We want to incorporate green stormwater infrastructure, not the pit surrounded by a fence that's got water in it with trash, not the basic sort of retention basin, but rather green stormwater infrastructure, bioswales, rain gardens, et cetera. Increasing energy efficiency, okay, in our buildings. And that's building materials, but it's also building siding, keeping trees, it's reflective roofs, it's a variety of things. Maybe even how climate control is managed inside the building. All of these aspects have land use connotations associated with them. Compact development patterns as part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the amount of vehicles miles traveled, compact development patterns. The ability to walk, right? Not use your car, also important. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you see a slider. And that slider's there because, as I mentioned, there are some overlaps and some areas of convergence and some area of divergence across some of the ideas. And I want to just mention to you some of the things that have been said to us or that we've sort of figured out as we've worked on your stuff. So the first of those is, climate resilience actions could raise the cost of development, okay? We know that we want to make sure that development is affordable, right? That's one of the monikers for Carrboro Connects is affordable housing. Climate resilience actions might make some developments more expensive. So we've got a question of balance, right? It's also necessary to balance the ideas between increased density and compact development form and its impact on climate resilience goals, right? We want to have better stormwater facilities. We want to have more affordable development. We also want to be more dense. We want to cover more land area with buildings. That makes stormwater, in some cases, potentially more expensive. So how do we manage that? How do we navigate those two competing ideas, right? Also, climate resiliency, or the actions that we take under the banner of climate resiliency could, disproportionately impact the BIPOC community, right? There are portions of the community that have special environmental sensitivity. And it's not because, we made it that way. That was how it was sort of occurred in the natural world. And in some instances, the people who live in those areas over the arc of time, are part of the BIPOC community. And the efforts that we undertake to address climate resiliency could have a disproportionate impact on those folks. And that's something, obviously, that you guys have thought about. We want to let you know that we're aware of it, and that this is an issue of balance that we're going to be exploring as we move through the process. Okay? Let's talk about race and equity. So it's very clear. We want more housing, and we need more lot size options. We need to be accommodating multi-generational housing. We need to be aware of the density impacts in our historically black neighborhoods and our BIPOC residents. We need to be looking at, sort of economic sustainability issues like micro or affordable commercial uses, right? How can people have businesses and jobs here in the community? Reviewing conditions, covenants, and restrictions, CC&Rs. These are documents that are established as part of most any neighborhood these days. Any neighborhood that's got a homeowners association has CCRs, okay? But embedded in those covenants and conditions documents are also the provisions that address affordability. They address the provisions related to rent versus ownership, okay? That's where that material lives. Now, the town currently, and as it should, reviews these CCR documents, but that review might need to focus more on affordability and the nature of ownership versus rental, okay? So that's something that we would expect to be coming down the line. Also, just frankly, bread and butter issues like process, making sure that it's clear. Clear language. Not everybody speaks English as the first language, right? Perhaps office hours, perhaps some way for the town to make themselves more available for people who have day jobs, who maybe need help navigating, what's in the UDO, or how to think about a proposed development in their neighborhood, et cetera. So that's something that we're exploring. While office hours aren't something that would be inside of your UDO text, it's absolutely part and parcel of how we operationalize these regulations, okay? So that's the race and equity sort of basket as we've identified it thus far. As I mentioned before, there's always more work to do. You see the slider on the slide here. And so, there are some other questions. Densification, right? Talk a lot about densification. We need more density, have more houses to make it more affordable. Okay. A lot of people believe that densification can yield displacement, all right? And that's contrary to race and equity, right? Displacement's not something that we'd like to see as an outcome of our densification. There's a desire for increased community awareness and participation in our land use matters, that's something that is very important to this community, and having that community awareness and participation is really, really important. The very fact that you're including awareness and participation opportunities adds length to the process. It also adds unpredictability to the process. And so if you're in a situation where margins are tight because land is expensive, and you're a small community, a small company, or you're a nonprofit, and you're trying to provide for affordable housing, the last thing you want is a lengthy or unpredictable review process. So again, this question of balance. We've also got some law issues that we have to deal with, unfortunately. Federal law inhibits regulation based on ownership style, so we can't write development rules that that contemplate differential rules for rental versus ownership. That's not something that the UDO can address. Can the town address it through policy? Sure. Can the town address it through development agreement? Sure. Can the town address that through the Unified Development Ordinance? No. There's also some state law limitations that we've got to deal with. In North Carolina, we're not allowed to have inclusionary zoning. I know you know that. You guys have a process, a program in place where you're seeking 15% of the stock to be affordable. And that's something that we would suggest remain. In fact, perhaps even lean in a little bit deeper on. I think is probably one of the recommendations that you'll see as we continue to have discussions with the community. So just want to mention these issues for you guys. Obviously, your hearts are in the right place. Obviously, you've thought a lot about this. We have some balance issues to deal with, and we have some legal environment that's challenging for us, and we're going to have to navigate that. talk about attainable housing for a minute. Plan's very clear. Increase the number of attainable units. I use the word attainable housing. Attainable, obviously language is very, very important. And affordable housing to some people means one thing. Affordable housing to other people might mean something different, right? Some people use the word workforce housing. I prefer the term attainable housing, of which I include workforce, affordable as subsidized, and affordable as naturally occurring market rate affordable, okay? Regardless, we want to increase the number of attainable homes here in Cary. We want to increase densities, right? Especially in infill areas around the core. Plan words, not my words. This is what the plan says we want to do. We want to expand housing options, wider range of housing, right? Incentives for private sector supply of units. That is a policy and set of regulations that you guys have already been operating under for quite some time. There's an interesting question at the end of this, which is affordable housing for whom? There's a lot of Triangle communities who are throwing a lot of effort into affordable or attainable housing. Unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of affordable housing. We're just seeing a lot more housing. It just doesn't happen to be affordable. So, that is something that we need to keep in the back of our mind as we move forward. When we think about affordable or attainable, what does that mean? Some things to think about as we go forward with attainable housing. Market-based approaches can drive gentrification and displacement. I mentioned that before. Density increases, particularly in infill contexts, can run counter to community character. Okay, if you're a community of small buildings on small lots with spaces between the buildings, densification and increased development might run counter to that. Question of balance. Density increases can complicate stormwater management and conservation efforts. Economies of scale favor larger structures, right? But this may not contribute to housing option robustness. In other words, we might just have large apartment buildings. That's good, but people need other kinds of housing options. We need duplexes, we need multi-generational housing. There's a variety of things that need to be done here. If our market is a tough one to operate in because land's expensive or because the regulatory process takes time, there's an economy of scale for going for the larger buildings in those instances. Okay, so balancing that. Statutory limitations on inclusionary zoning, rent control, mentioned that already. The last point I want to leave you with is this. Opinions really differ on the ability of the private sector to provide attainable housing. The town may favor a two-pronged approach where there's a blend of market, private sector provision, and local government provision of affordable housing. I'll say to you that the likelihood of a solely market-based approach, where we just rely on the development that's coming into town to provide our affordable housing, is likely to be not as successful as a blended approach. And this is my fancy way of saying, if the town wants to provide affordable housing, the town needs to get into the business of providing affordable housing. That there is an important role for you guys to play in the provision of affordable housing. And that has precious little to do with the Unified Development Ordinance. You can continue to rely solely on the market if you wish to. The likelihood that you'll have success with that is probably not as good as a blended approach. And I just wanted to mention that to you. Oops.
This font issue, do you want to switch to the PDF version?
Sure. I don't.
Excuse me, just a minute. Sorry.
The expert in edit. For the record, I haven't used Courier font in the last 20 years. So what do you do? Thank you, Tina. Awesome.
apologies, everyone. I think that looks a little bit better.
Thank you. All right. Let's talk about community character. Community character, what is it? That's something that we're still working on defining. For sure, the UDO will include some pretty detailed definitions of what community character is, at least in Carrboro. One thing we're sure of is this. There's many different characters here, like most places. You guys have a very sort of tight urban core with sort of inner ring neighborhoods, with then sort of more suburban neighborhoods outside, and then rural. Pretty typical stuff, right? Your core and inner neighborhoods are compact with small lots, generally speaking, and small buildings, generally speaking. Compatible development does exist here. One of the things that's wonderful about Carrboro is going through particularly your older neighborhoods and seeing the smaller homes and how well they fit in their context with their neighbors, with the non-residential uses that are proximate, the mixed-use core that you have. We heard from many, many people who described the town as quirky or organic, and that people like that the quirkiness or the organic nature of town, is important and something that we should respect. And that's meaningful. It's much easier to code or to zone for bland and boring than it is to code or zone for quirky. So that's something that's our charge, is to figure out how do we protect and keep that part of Carrboro safe. Again, with the slider, more balance issues. Character protection provisions are often design-based, right? And design regulations increase development costs. They slow review times. Character provisions often result in greater regulatory complexity. Wait a minute, Chad, we want this to be simple. We want it to be predictable. We want it to be easy to use. Okay, great. Oh, and we also want to protect our character. Okay, so we have to balance. Also, large buildings seldom compatible with small town community character. And so we need to weigh in. The efficiencies of economies of scale, the provision of units, the densification, the larger buildings. How will that fit with community character that's in place? And how do we be respectful of that? Last pillar, predictability. So obviously we want to codify your rules to avoid discretionary review, okay? Discretionary review are things like zoning, special use permit, instances where there's a town body, board, commission, council, who's applying their discretion to a case, okay? I'm not saying don't have that. There's a time and a place for it. Point is, some local governments codify their rules in pursuit of avoiding discretionary reviews and holding those discretionary reviews when they're most needed, okay? I mentioned this at our last meeting. I know I talked about this at least with some of the folks during our interviews. Identifying preferred development forms, spending a little bit of time on the front end with the community to identify preferred development forms, and then making those the path of least resistance. Spend the time with the people who live here to find out what they want. Reach agreement on that. If you have an applicant come before you and they're giving you what you said you wanted, then let them do it, because that's what you said you wanted, okay? Measurable review criteria. Your review criteria for development applications should be measurable wherever possible. That's a challenge, but it makes it predictable. It makes it understandable. Timelines. We've heard a lot about timelines from the development community, and they've got a point. Timeline is important. Time is money. Okay, agreed. There's a timeline for staff. There's also a timeline for applicants, and you need to recognize that It's not okay to submit material late. It's not okay to put staff in a position where they're not able to turn around a thoughtful review. So the timeline sword cuts both ways. Making sure that your staff is comfortable exercising the decision authority that they have. One of the things we heard was staff won't make a judgment call. That's something to explore. Why won't staff make a judgment call? Incorporating flexibility, incentives, and safety valves. Flexibility is something that you need particularly in a mature built community like yours. You guys have small lots, you've got buildings close together, you've got a lot of competing goals that you want to reach. The easy sites are built. The only thing left are the tough sites, and that's where we need the flexibility. Problem is that we want a predictable zoning ordinance. Predictable can sometimes be rigid. Flexibility is on the other side of the continuum from predictability. So where is that balance, and how do we find a happy medium there? Incorporating safety valves, very, very important. Unintended consequences happen when you've got a difficult site or a difficult set of conditions to deal with. Sometimes it's important to bring in some sort of administrative variance or some form of alternative equivalent compliance so that an applicant can move forward with their project in ways that are consistent with the comp plan and the will of the town. So those are things that are important. Like all of the other pillar slides, this one has the slider on it. Let me go back. Administrative decision-making minimizes the role of public comment. Okay? So we want more density, we want more affordability, we want a faster review process, and we want it less expensive. Okay. There may be some need to give a little bit on the public participation side. Administrative decision-making removes discretionary review and conditions of approval. There's a lot of local governments out there, I know you guys are not one, who want to see every single site plan and they want to pore over every single development and be sure that they know exactly what's coming in. And that's fine, as long as you recognize that that adds time, it removes predictability, and you're less apt to have affordable development in those kinds of conditions. I mentioned before, this sort of administrative codified sort of approach to regulation, it can be rigid, right? It can be inflexible. Worse still, it can create a lowest common denominator mindset where everything looks the same, right? And that's not quirky. That's the same. I won't pick on any nearby communities who might have that challenge. Finally, the administrative process is really ill-equipped to handle important questions about compatibility, okay? If you're gonna go down this road and talk about what is or is not compatible, what is or is not in harmony with its surroundings, those are discretionary decision-making processes. Administrative decision-making is not discretionary. And so contemplation about harmony or compatibility is beyond the pale of the administrative review process. And so if you're in a situation where you've got a lot of compatibility concerns associated with the development, right, then the administrative process might not get you where you want to be. It might leave you hanging. So those are important things to think about. We have to kind of balance all of this stuff. And I realize that this is a lot to throw at you, but I wanted you to know that, for every coin has two sides. And we need to be aware of that as we go forward. All right. Talked about that. I'll get it with this technology. Okay, that is the pillars portion. We had anticipating hearing more from you guys about Carrboro Connects, hearing more about the pillars, and hearing more about your concerns about what you'd like the UDO to focus on or the things that we need to address. I want to leave the pillars for a second, talk a little bit about what's to come, talk a little bit about legislation, and then maybe move into discussion if that's acceptable to the group. Okay. So our first public forum is scheduled for Thursday, February 20th in this very room. We'll have an introductory video. We'll have people come into room 100. They'll see the short video. They'll come in here. We hope to have several stations that are based on the pillars, asking questions of people. What does density mean to you? What does race and equity mean to you? What does climate action mean to you? Also, how does the UDO impact you? I think that's going to be one of the important things that we really focus on. You guys all know what a UDO is, and you understand its ramifications. Most of the community, no clue about this stuff, about how deeply the UDO impacts every aspect of your life, whether you can walk to the store, whether there's a store to walk to, how many trees are there, whether there's sidewalks there or not, why it's not there, how your taxes are affected, etc. And the list goes on and on. Helping people understand the UDO is not just some dusty document in a dark room at Town Hall, but rather something that has really tangible, visceral impacts on what it's like to live in Carrboro, and how important it is that people get involved in that. So we hope to inform and inquire about that subject matter. We'll have some samples of other development codes for those code nerds who want to look at other development codes and see what it's like. We'll be happy to share some examples, hopefully inspire people to give us some thoughts about what they'd like to see in terms of their development regulations. And then finally, sort of a discussion area or an ideas area so that we can have some one-on-one conversations. So come in, get your introductory video, come and participate and learn at the stations, and then take a few minutes if you have questions or comments and share those with a person in a one-to-one format. So that's our plan. We'll do this on Thursday night, and then we'll do it again on Saturday morning. Hopefully we'll catch the farmers market crowd. So that is our hope for Public Forum 1. This is the first of many public forums. In fact, I believe there's at least 5 of them in this process. This is the project website. It goes through your social pinpoint site, which is engagecarrboro.nc.gov. There you will find a link to the Unified Development Ordinance project, along with the several other projects that you guys are underway with. So I'll just mention that that is there. And with that, I'll talk about legislation and compliance. You guys have been very patient. I appreciate it. So North Carolina is a Dillon rule state. And that means that the powers and authorities that local governments have to regulate land use is given to them by the General Assembly. We are not a home rule state where local governments have authority to adopt whatever rules they like. The rules, regulations that are adopted in local governments in North Carolina are subject to General Assembly review and approval, okay? And that's part of the Dillon rule ethos that exists here. Love it or hate it, that's what we've got to deal with, okay? Now, the General Assembly adds new planning-related legislation every single year. Every year, we'll have more regulations to deal with. I've got some, on the screen you see a document that we prepare for our clients. Every year we put out this year's session law hit parade. Those are things that local governments have to change in their rules. And I put that in there so that you know that this document, this UDO, is a living document. It will change. It's not a set it and forget it kind of a thing. It's something that the town needs to commit to actively revising annually, and maybe even more frequently than that. Upon adoption, will this document be perfect? It sure will. Okay, maybe it won't be perfect, but fortunately, we'll be around for a little while to help you guys navigate some of those challenges. And it helps you get into the mindset that this is a living document. I've had a lot of clients tell me, you know, hey, you got a problem with the UDO, change is 30 days away. And that's a pretty accurate statement. You know, this is y'all's document and you can adjust it. A lot of this stuff will be right. There will be some challenges. That's normal. It's to be expected. And even if we get everything 100% right and there's nothing to change, guess what? Jones Street's going to bring you changes every year no matter what. The last point, or last couple of points, sadly aren't happy ones. over the last 10 or 12 years, we have watched local government autonomy diminish in North Carolina. And I don't need to tell you guys that. I know that you know that. And that creates an interesting climate for us because we have to navigate that. We have to do more with less. And that's been the stance that all local governments in North Carolina have been in for the last decade. I'd love to tell you that the troubles are over. We will likely see more what I call existential legislation in 2025. 2024 brought us a special little bill that we're going to talk about in a minute, but it also brought us potential abolition of ETJ. We've seen annexation affected. We've seen design control taken away. We've seen limitations on stormwater, and the list goes on. 2025 likely holds more of the same for us. We'll be here to navigate that with you. With that, I hate to end on a Debbie Downer note. We could either go and talk about Senate Bill 382 if you'd like to, or we can have discussion and we can talk about 382 at the very end. I believe Mr. Hornick is here with information for us on 382 as well. I was going to talk about it, but I'm happy to do discussion first and we can come back, or we can just get this legislation stuff over with. What's the pleasure?
What's the pleasure?
Let's get legislation done, I
You want it
think.
now?
Get it out
Yeah.
of the way.
Okay,
Okay.
looks like no.
All right. Okay. Senate Session Law 2024-57, also known as SB Senate Bill 382, has a lot of stuff in it. In fact, I was in this room, this very room, when I found out that page 131 was tacked on to that bill. I was presenting to you guys that evening. It was 9 p.m. when this particular piece of legislation went in to Senate Bill 382. And I'm talking specifically about Section 160D-601, the downzoning portion. And so this downzoning bill does a couple of things. The first is that it bars you from downzoning property without property owner consent, okay? Prior to December 11th, if this council wished to initiate a zoning change and take a zoning district downwards or reduce development potential, it could do so of its own volition, of its own legislative discretion. You did not need consent to do that. By the way, there are plenty of comprehensive plan policies in lots of governments across North Carolina that call on local governments to do that very thing, to downzone property, to remove development potential from certain locations, right? Think about Western North Carolina and the fact that there are now rivers where there were not rivers before. And what do we do about the zoning that's on that property or that's in the bottom of the river? So this issue about downzoning is not some strange, weird, ethereal thing that comes up. This is a normal day-to-day operation. Senate Bill 382 bars you from doing that without prior property owner consent. In other words, you need to, before you initiate a downzoning, go out and get the consent of everybody who would be affected by that downzoning. Their written consent from everybody who's affected. Now, that has tons and tons of ramifications associated with it, right? For example, what if the property's in probate, right? What if somebody has died and the property is in the sort of custodialship of a judge? There is no owner. How do you get consent from something where there's no owner? That's a big challenge. It's one of many. Is consent forever? Can I rescind my consent? Those questions are unanswered. 382 does a couple of other things too. You can't lower development potential. In other words, you can't go in and reduce the range of allowable uses, okay, that are permitted in a zoning district without prior consent, nor can you lower density. Now, lower densities, that's not really our bag here in Carrboro. We're looking to raise densities, at least in some places. Okay, so that's happy news. But this issue about allowable uses and discretionary permits, I'd heard an idea. It was one that I thought was very innovative, which is perhaps, maybe, single-family detached residential dwellings should have to go through a higher level permit process. Perhaps they should be held to a higher standard. Perhaps we should use a special use permit or some other kind of discretionary process to do that going forward. Guess what? 382 would require you to obtain consent from every single one of those landowners before you could initiate that change. Okay? One last thing, if that weren't enough. Any changes to your development regulations that render or amount to or work on the creation of a nonconformity on an existing site requires consent. So let me give you some examples of what that might look like. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that here in Carrboro you decided that convenience stores require 5 parking places today, and it's not enough. We're having new things come into convenience stores, restaurants and cat adoptions and, whatever you got, massage parlors, whatever it is, coming into convenience stores. We're seeing that these days. 5 parking places isn't enough. We need 7. We think, staff's researched this. We've had our parking consultant in, and consensus is 5 is too few. We need 7. So let's write a text amendment. Okay. Write a text amendment to change the number of parking spaces for convenience stores from 5 to 7. Everybody who has an existing convenience store on the ground with 5 parking spaces, who was lawful, who, met all the rules in place at the time that they were approved, is now or would be rendered nonconforming. You got to get their consent, okay? And that same process is true whether it's signs, landscaping, stormwater, setbacks, and so on and so on.
Bike parking?
So this bill has a lot of ramifications for us. Now, it's not all bad news. On the screen, you see 2 columns. There's a gray column, which are the things that you have to have consent in order to do. But then there's the white column on the right-hand side of the screen. There are some things that we can do. All is not lost. We can still write new zoning districts, okay, and apply whatever standards we'd like to those zoning districts, as long as we don't lay them on the ground and just make them available for people to request. We're not creating any nonconformities. We're not lowering any development potentials. We're not changing densities, okay? So that's part of a strategy here. We can certainly raise development potential, and we've had a lot of discussion about the possibility of doing just that, right? We want higher buildings. We want more densities. We want the ability to have more kinds of residential. That's increasing development potential. That's fine. No problem under 382, okay? Increases in development standards that we apply solely to development on residential lots in residential zoning districts. We can do that. That's okay. This non-conforming business applies only to development on non-residential lots. Increasing development standards on undeveloped lots, okay? If there's nothing on the lot, we can write new standards and apply them, and we're not creating a nonconformity. Why? Because there's nothing on the lot. So that's cool. And we can still do incentives. We can still do flexibility provisions. There's still some things that we can do, but there are also some challenges for us, particularly with respect to existing developed lots and how we navigate that, which yields kind of the biggest challenge or concern of the whole thing. The consent issue is a concern because how do we get it and can it be rescinded? All right? But this issue about who's conforming, who's not conforming, what set of rules were in place when it was built, that all has to be tracked. It all has to be understood and made available for anybody to find out about. And that, my friends, is a gargantuan task that few staffs across the state are prepared for. We're not even sure how we're going to do it. So that's the lay of the land with 382. By the way, this is law. This was adopted. Governor vetoed it. Veto was overridden. This is law in North Carolina. Now, we've seen a handful of bills come out this year, 2025, one of which is House Bill 24. House Bill 24 seeks a full rescission of the changes to 160D 601 that are embedded in this bill. It came up through the House. We've seen sponsors join, secondary sponsors. I believe it's up to 25, 30 sponsors. That's good. That's a good thing. But that's out of the House. It's not out of the Senate. It takes two to tango. Both chambers have to agree. We've also seen a handful of exemption bills, okay? There's a series of exemption bills, House Bill 25, House Bill 68, that seek to exempt counties and the municipalities in those counties, okay? There's also a pair of Senate bills that also seek exemption, some for sort of northeastern North Carolina and one for Catawba and Stanley counties. And I think we've seen, I'm sorry, the other Senate bill is Buncombe County. My apologies, Asheville. So handful of Senate bills seeking exemption, handful of House bills seeking exemption, and one sort of out-and-out rescission bill. And that's all potentially happy news. Please, question.
What was that bill, the House bill?
The rescission bill?
Yeah.
House Bill 24
24.
is the name of that, is the number of that bill. And like I said, there's been 25 or 30 sponsors, so that's great. The concerning piece is there's no companion Senate bill, and the Senate will have to vote and approve, this bill to rescind that portion of 382. And so that's the lay of the land. Several of Code Rights clients have put together, signed and sent resolutions seeking, sort of stating an opposition to the bill, or at least this portion of 382, and requesting exemption from it. As a local bill, okay? And so local governments, as you guys know, I'm sure you do this all the time, you send up legislation to your representatives, your senators, and ask them to sponsor that for you in whatever chamber. This is one of those opportunities. You could decide, if you wish, to prepare a resolution of opposition or a resolution of opposition and exemption that you sign and you give to your legislative junket and ask them to file on your behalf. Another alternative or option for you is to join another bill, right? So the bills that we've seen in the House and the Senate that are exemption bills are groups of jurisdictions, a county and all of the municipalities within it, or in some instances, multiple counties and the jurisdictions within it. So that's another option. You can join one of the existing, you can propose your own, or you can work with your neighbors to seek one for your larger area. But time is short. Filing deadlines are this month. So, any questions about 382?
Is there information from Bob Hornick? Did you want to share that now, council members? Do you want to?
One question before.
You want to hear a question?
I have
No,
one
a
question.
question before we hear from Bob Hornick. Yes, Councilmember Frey.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could clarify something for me about the point one in your gray list here, reducing the range of allowable uses within existing zoning districts. This is something that I find pretty challenging to understand when I'm looking at the law itself.
Sure.
I've seen it framed as number. I've seen it framed as just the uses. I've seen it framed as the range of uses. So my question is, let's assume for a second that I am creating no nonconformity, that the use I'm talking about is not present on a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I swap out that use for some other use, so there's no change in the number of uses. I'm not changing the character of the lot from residential to non-residential or vice versa. Is there any clarity yet on that impact? Is it just no use may be removed from a lot that it is currently present on, even if that doesn't create a nonconformity? Or is there some other metric that's being applied, or is it actually unclear?
I'm going to give you a lawyer answer, and I'm not a lawyer. You know, maybe this is better coming from Bob. It depends. So, in terms of thinking through what happens when there's a use allowed on a use table that we're removing, we're taking that out from that district. That is characterized as a reduction in the range of uses that are permissible in that district, whether or not those uses exist today or not. So a rigid interpretation of the law would tell you that that equals a reduction. Now, the point that you raise, it doesn't say, you know, which uses, it just says fewer uses. So what if I added 15 new uses and took one away? Is that okay? I believe the consensus among the thinkers thus far is no, that's not okay. So that's where we are. I'll give you one last thing to think about or chew on, raise at the next cocktail party, which is temporary uses. Could we remove a range of temporary uses, and would that be considered to be a downzoning? And I am not sure at this point. So that is one of many questions that remain unanswered for us. I would say depends on your risk tolerance in this environment. I would err on being more risk tolerant, but that's y'all's decision to make, and you should absolutely talk to your attorney about that. It's hopeful that this bill will be rescinded. I've heard from some people, I won't say who aren't necessarily going to make changes to their development regulations and are going to wait for the courts to rule. And that will for sure happen. It's just going to take a little while, that's all.
Thank you. Did you have something, Mr. Hornick?
Yeah, just very briefly, excuse me, and I agree with Chad on the uncertainty of what the SB 382 really means. I spoke with, or communicated with Erin Winia, who is the Director of Governmental Affairs for the League of Municipalities yesterday. And she told me that her office is working hard in the legislature for a repeal, and that they've got a couple of fallback positions that I haven't spoken to her in great detail about. But short, if they can't get a repeal, they're getting something that will clarify at least and hopefully reduce the impact of the no downzoning regulations. So that is underway, and she said it's their top priority for her group over at the League. So that was heartening to hear. The other thing I would just, in my 20 some odd years of experience with Carrboro, there have been very few downzonings. It's not something that happens all that frequently. I think to the extent that there are or would be downzonings, it would be more likely in a conditional zoning kind of context where property owners, applicants ask for changes in the zoning ordinance that not necessarily reduce density, but change the process or impose greater setbacks or buffers or things like that that might be considered downzoning under the language that is there right now. So, I don't know whether this council needs to adopt any kind of resolution asking for an exemption or for a local bill. That's more of, I think, a political question than a legal question at this point. But I would say that I know that the League is working on it, and I know that we have not done much downzoning, if any, over the course of many, many years. And as long as our UDO rewrite isn't really seeking to downzone, I mean, I think we're planning to kind of not change the zoning classifications and uses. That's my understanding at this point, anyway. So I don't know how much risk there is for us to not participate in or adopt a resolution, but we should be talking to our legislative body, our legislators here in the county, and let them know that we're concerned and why we're concerned, and they'll do some work for us there too.
Thank you, Mr. Hornick. I see Councilman Posada and then Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I took a quick look at the bill and looking at the sponsors, and this might be a question that you may or may not be ready to answer. But given that out of the four main sponsors, you have two members of House leadership. Give it minor leadership, but leadership none, and then two very well respected members of the caucus. I looked at also the co-sponsors, and you're looking at a pretty robust list of representatives. We're having, of course, both Price and Boyne joined the co-sponsors, but you also have Prather, and you have some folks in rural areas, and quite a good mix. Do you have an understanding, and I was looking also that it was pulled out of Commerce, put into Judiciary 3, which tends to be a fairly good committee from previous interventions when we have people in leadership kind of trying to man some of these things. Do we have any idea of the trajectory of this bill and any appetite in the Senate to take it on?
Right. That's a great question. And I'm not a gambling man, so I do this for a living. I have heard anecdotally, and it is hearsay, that the Senate does not support exemption.
Okay.
I'm sorry, that the Senate doesn't support a repeal. This bill, 382, came out of the Senate.
Yeah.
And so it's logical that they wouldn't necessarily support repeal of it. I have heard that some senators have extended or are relying on the exemption provision to address situations. So, we have a few clients who are in that situation, who are Western, North Carolina communities, who are having problems and need FEMA money and don't have flood regulations in place and can't put them in place because to do so would be a downzoning or at least a creation of nonconformity. So exemption has been held up as a solution by members of the Senate, to my knowledge. And I've heard some folks say, yeah, the Senate isn't really on board with a repeal. Hearsay. I have no evidence or nothing credible in that regard. But it is a great question, and you're absolutely right that there are some very prominent representatives on the House side who have thrown their support behind HB 24, which is encouraging.
And it's rare to see the number of high hitters on both ends joining a bill like this. And I was looking at who's in leadership in both parties and seeing some of those names pop up. So that's great. I mean, I figured it was a long shot to have a little bit more of that, but it's something to keep an eye out. I imagine that as we move into the rest of the session, there's going to be some chips and decisions coming out. We usually see this all the time where the House has something, the Senate has something, and they just negotiate what goes through.
That's right.
Okay, and then I just also wanted to let folks on this side know that both Representative Price and Boyne have joined, so maybe it would be useful to have a conversation with Senator Meyer about anything that can be done on the Senate side if we're interested in that piece. But I would also be in support of taking some kind of action against this, or in support of this repeal. Out of that, I don't have any more questions on this piece, so I'll wait for other council members to make the discussion. Madam Mayor.
Is that your support for some type of resolution or?
If the council decided to move in that field or some kind of resolution or statement or anything along those lines, I'd definitely be in support of it and happy to work with any council members to draft that if that's also needed.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have asked council members about their interests in drafting some type of resolution or letter of support. And so that's something that has occurred, just gauging interest. Councilmember Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Firstly, I just want to say I very recently attended the Essentials of Local Government, and your name came up multiple times, always in a good light. I just want to say I feel like we're in such good hands, given the number of different people from different parts of the state who gave you praise while I was there. So, just thanks for that. But when it comes to asking for an exemption as a strategy, one of my concerns is so. I don't know how widespread this is in Latin America, but there's this saying where my mom is from, para mis amigos todo, para mis enemigos la ley. For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law. And I just, I have concerns about seeking an exemption without us coming as part of a larger group, maybe a multi-county group. So that's, I think I'll just leave that there on that front.
All right, and so Councilmember Palmer, so not as a municipality, but as some type of countywide effort.
That would be my personal preference, but I'm happy to
Right.
be
Yeah, that's smart.
follow the
Yeah,
lead of
I
others.
agree. I think that makes sense. Council members, any other questions about Mayor Pro Tem now?
Yeah, I mean, I think to my mind, it puts us talking about repeal more than exception. I have a hard time imagining even Orange County being considered a viable exception, or in the jurisdictions they're in. So I think, you know, I'm very interested in a resolution at this point. Following the lead of the league and our delegation, I think we should all circle back, you know, amongst ourselves and get in touch with our delegation and figure out if that is a desirable stick to take to the rock. But if it is, let's wedge it up under there.
Go right ahead, Councilmember Hammond.
Thank you for the presentation. This is great. I went through the Coates Cannon material, getting ready for tonight. I've talked to folks, and I just want to convey appreciation from community folks who attended the meeting and really appreciated not only being able to have input, but the reception of their input was very positive. Cristobal, I agree with you about the looking at joining, and I'm going to say the reason why is based on what Bob was just saying. I couldn't think of an example in Carrboro of downzoning in all my time here that was not something that was connected with maybe out in the ETJ or something, but not within municipal Carrboro. And for that reason, I think we'd have a more powerful position being supportive rather than, because it doesn't apply to us so much. And so that, to me, logically makes more sense to take a position based on what our own experience is and the expectation that we can be supportive of someone who's in greater need.
Thank you, Councilmember Haven O'Donnell. Is this all the comments for SB 382, everyone? Okay. Are we ready to get some other questions or clarifications from Mr. Meadows? Did you have anything else, Mr. Meadows?
Not on 382, except to say no matter what, you know, we'll help you guys come up with a strategy. Hopefully we won't have to, but if we do, we're here to work through that with you guys.
Thank you. Council members, other questions about the presentation, in general, points of clarification or anything? Councilmember Frey, recognized.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Meadows, I understand you've gone through the, just to make sure that I understand the basis for what you've laid out here. You have gone through our comprehensive plan. You've got the input, you've got the interviews.
Correct.
Okay. Did you find a pillar for community character in our comprehensive plan?
No.
I'm curious what it is that led you to inject another pillar into this process.
The interplay of the desire to raise densities, to raise building heights, to manifest increased development potential, while at the same time also trying to address transportation and environmental consideration, led me to believe that community character was something that we should be thinking about and be thoughtful about. You know, again, this is a nebulous concept. There are not a lot of local governments who have regulations addressing directly community character. And so we don't have a lot of models to go on. At the same time, you know, we want to have success with this project just like you do. And I think it's important that we explore and calibrate our suggestions for densification and increased height and all of those things that are necessary and desirable, but do it in ways that fit within the context of the community. We've seen in some of your neighbors lately efforts to densify, efforts to accommodate more residential in ways that are profound and have had, I'm not going to say deleterious outcomes, but have definitely changed the face of where they were located. And that's something that we think should be factored in, something that we think is part of the package of success. And that's the reason.
Thank you. I appreciate you giving that context. I don't know that that changes how I receive it, though, which is as basically reopening the structure of our comprehensive plan to say, hey, you missed something here. I'm not sure that I think that that is something that we want to do as part of this project. As you said, character is a nebulous concept, but in most times and most places in the United States, in the context of zoning, what it is a racist dog whistle. So I would suggest, Mr. Meadows, being very cautious in how you allow that to pull you with regard to the rest of the project. I think that's my comment for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Haven O'Donnell.
Yeah, so as I was looking over materials, I was remembering conversations in Carrboro amongst the Board of Aldermen going way, way back. Tina will remember this, about architectural vernacular and whether or not that's part of this LUO conversation, because I really couldn't find it anywhere, but knowing what the downtown Carrboro neighborhoods, they're a patchwork, and all of Carrboro is like a necklace of pearls, and each pearl is a neighborhood, right? And so I just wonder where that fits in, rather than waiting for it to come up explosively at some other point, because we never really nailed that down. But downtown Carrboro could be deeply impacted, and so all that, the feels of Carrboro and that quirkiness, which comes probably out of an architectural vernacular, how and where does that get addressed?
And Councilmember Haven O'Donnell, are you concerned about a change that could potentially come to the?
I don't know how it factors in, but I think it's important that, so you take the Strayhorn House and you take properties near it, and if they are, architecturally changed dramatically,
Oh, I understand.
that gives a very different feel,
I got it, thanks.
because that corridor is significant in that way.
Thanks for that.
It's a great question. Oftentimes the architectural provisions kind of, there's a continuum, right? So there's some very basic architectural provisions that you're all very familiar with and that you administer regularly. Things like building height, amount of impervious surface cover, floor area, very, very typical. And as you kind of move along the continuum, we get to things like building massing, or how many windows, or exterior materials, or colors. And some communities, will go even farther, particularly in historic districts. And so, there is a spectrum, there's a continuum there. I think our objective would be to have the least intrusive set of regulations possible to protect character without saddling, the town with lots of complexity, without sort of imposing will. I have a sinking feeling, and it's just a hunch, if Carrboro's like a lot of other places, some of the coolest places were built without zoning regulations. And that is a truism. There's no getting around that.
Right.
And so, I think we're sensitive to not wanting to overregulate, to trying to find the most effective, least intrusive, most bang for our buck in terms of what architectural provisions get implemented. Having said all of that, also know that in North Carolina, 1 and 2 family homes, and that includes townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, you're not authorized to mandate design controls. They can be proposed as conditions, and they can be accepted or not accepted by an applicant. But multifamily, you can control design if you choose to. Non-residential, you can if you choose to. And I think that's part of the question and part of the line of discussion that we need to have going forward. How far into this do we want to go? Some, a little, a lot. We need to kind of talk about what the options are, what the pros are, what the cons are.
Yeah.
This is a decision that you guys and your community are going to make. We're here to put stuff on the table for you to consider.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that came out of not only having advisory board input, but council deliberation, and this is just a tiny little example, but when you look back on it, you realize how important it was, and it's the Hampton Inn having a blade sign. Instead of having the emblazoned Hampton Inn at the top, it's a little blade sign along the corner. That came out of advisory board deliberations and council deliberation, and work with the owners, the developers.
Right.
So that's something that comes under flexibility, but look at what a difference it makes. And I don't know how many years it is now, but the reason that it's so significant is you don't notice it.
Right. Right. And thank you. I agree. I've done a lot of work in Greenville, South Carolina, and they'll be the first to tell you that you can have all the best design standards in the world and still have ugly buildings, and they're absolutely right. I realize I'm not making the case here for zoning, but understand that the situation that you referred to, with the Hampton Inn, if you had no regulations on the book, you most certainly would not have a blade sign there.
Thank you. Chad, I want to thank you for steering us in the right direction on a couple big things. One of the things that our council has begun to talk about, I think more seriously since I've been on, is our different role in affordability. We've been talking a little bit more about land acquisition and gap financing as necessary steps beyond what the market provides us. I think that's largely spurred by your perspective, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the consideration and deliberation across the board here. I do want to add my pretty grave concern about the emphasis on character. I would say that the comprehensive plan can be taken as our perspective on character. And what I hear most often from residents, well, no, actually not most often, but what I hear very often from residents is that we take the notion of Carrboro's character to be about its relative economic attainability to the surrounding area at one time. And that's gone. We know it's gone. You know, we know that it is not possible any longer to pretend this is the cheap rent next to the university.
Right.
But being the cheap rent is what gave us the character more than any architectural vernacular or any other common association. What you and I discussed when we talked in private or in a small group was that we know we know we will hear disproportionately in community who is able to participate. We know we will hear disproportionately in favor of discretionary review, of complexity, of what will sometimes be called flexibility. I want to be very clear that we are not interested in pursuing that. Like, these community conversations have been had. Carrboro Comprehensive Plan. What I'm coming to, the sole thing I'm coming to regret about it is that it's so big that perhaps it can be taken as equivocal in some places. But I believe that its overarching goals are not. I believe that it maybe attempts to do a little more toward those overarching goals, and I think that the reason it does is because we were so overdue in doing it. And so we find ourselves in another place where we are undertaking something that we have not done recently enough as a town.
Right.
And we find ourselves with, tendrils and branches in beds that we wish were better mulched.
Sure.
And so I want to be really clear that success in this project will be a document that does not equivocate. And we appreciate very much that it's your job to be considerate and deliberative about these things at this point. But, I don't think that we believe as a board that we are hampered in a lack of clarity about the possibility of combining density, affordability, stormwater. There are models for smaller footprints and ecological intervention that we have discussed and admired. And we see those reflected in the comprehensive plan. And so, I would like to stop talking because I think that's pretty clear.
Okay, Mayor Pro Tem now, he's going to stop talking. Councilmember Merrill.
So I had two completely unrelated comments. One, just about kind of this concept of architectural vernacular, character, et cetera. Ways that it could possibly be compatible with, streamlined development, affordability, is the concept of pre-approved plans. So I think it's something that we should consider and would hopefully be part of, in the interest of seeing more of the development that we'd all like to see. And I think there's ways that we can kind of, we can't control design on a, build by build basis. But again, if we have pre-approved plans that look the way we want, people like the way they look, it would also help kind of like assuage some fears of like, oh, we're going to have Texas donuts everywhere. It's like, no, we're going to have duplexes and triplexes that fit next to your house, and they're going to get built quick, and they're going to be more affordable, and you're going to have nice neighbors. So that's my one semi-related comment. Something to consider. The other unrelated comment is just looking through the existing land use ordinance. I'm all about street sections. I know that's less interesting to other people, but turning radiuses, lane width, things like that. I want to make sure that is that we have kind of, of course, I want to make sure that we're considering that as we're kind of looking through this. I'd like to see something closer to NACDO design standards than kind of highway design standards. So just plant that seed.
Thank you, Councilmember Merrill. I appreciate everything that I'm hearing. Nobody has anything. So, Mr. Meadows.
I think Councilmember Palmer.
Oh, did you have something else?
If I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to piggyback on that, not to reopen the 382, but bike parking would be something that I feel personally we would want to nudge people in certain directions, and I don't know the best way to do that, but I've definitely seen some things that are technically in compliance I've seen some things that are technically in compliance that are kind of difficult to use if you're actually on a bike. And so that in my mind is that's not something that we've done that in the past. From one perspective, that might not be in community character, but from another, it very much feels in community character because that's part of our values. And so I wrote more on that community character page than on any other, and I just want to thank Councilmember Frey for their comments on that. It makes me feel itchy in a way that I'm having trouble articulating super well, but I wrote down the word safe because it came out, and I don't know if that was just a throwaway, and I don't mean to hold you there, but the thought that I had in the moment was that things that are dead are safe, that things that are static and unchanging are also not a vibrant community where I want to live. And so we all live here. We don't want, well, first of all, no one's going to come in and build a 20-story building in Carrboro, right? That's just not a...
Check.
So there's only so much that can happen, and also, when I first moved to Carrboro, I lived in an apartment complex that has changed over at least 3 times in terms of its outward presentation, but I actually canvassed it recently, and it has not changed one bit inside. And it is walkable from there to one of 2 grocery stores from the same brand, one off of Jones Ferry and one off of the main T's into 54. And it just, I think part of the reason that it makes me itch a little bit to hear this community character is that you can find L-shaped strip malls like that anywhere in the state, anywhere in America. And is that part of the community character that people feel passionately and want to defend? It kind of makes, I'm really uncomfortable with this notion of community character as a pillar. You might think that if you have 2 pillars, you add a third, it makes it more stable and safe, but you're actually more likely to break the lintel on top. I should probably shut up too.
You know what? Are you finished?
I'm done.
Yes.
I'm done.
Go ahead. Councilmember Hazel O'Donnell. You have something
Chad,
else?
maybe you could explain more clearly what you mean by community character, because when you said it, I was thinking that you were aiming for something that was more holistic in the interface between the 4 other pillars than something that was really siloed on its own.
I think that, contemplation about community character has to be brought into any discussion about, new development, infill, redevelopment, development in the downtown. I think that zoning regulations that seek to, dramatically increase or make significant change should include some thought about where, the locations that we are seeking to change and how we accommodate, these new interventions, what could very well be very positive, very necessary. I think intervention sometimes has a negative connotation when it shouldn't. The fact is that it's really expensive in Carrboro, and you don't have enough housing. And how are we going to deal with that? I think those are really existential questions that need to be dealt with. At the same time, I also think that one of the things that we heard from people is, I really like that Carrboro is a small town. I really like that the buildings are small. I really like that it's kind of quirky. And so, I think that position or that, that statement, is just as important as, hey, I can't afford a home in the community. So I think we want to incorporate community character, or at least think about it as part of the process. I don't think that, we need to center on it. I don't think it needs to be the center of our consideration. But I do think that, when you're thinking about redevelopment that is of a level of intensity that is an order of magnitude beyond its neighbors, then what sorts of things might we introduce or suggest be considered as part of that so that it can live with its neighbors? And, you know, I mean, this is y'all's, you know, it's your issue to guide us on. I just wanted to be sure that you realize that that's something that we're thinking about and that that's important. And really, that's as far as it goes.
What's the relationship between community character, so to speak, and, you know, and how we are looking at economic development in the downtown? Because you see, Carrboro is largely a destination economy, other than the, you know, property tax, right? So, you know, thinking about the LUO and downtown development, right? You want to have a place, for lack of better, I'm just going to say like downtown Asheville, that there's a vibe there, people want to be there, because it's inviting and it's welcoming. I mean, to me, would be the interface of economic development plans and this question of character.
Sure. I think, you know, I agree, or at least I'll restate that, you know, this idea of community character is nebulous, and it is something that we would need to talk about and think about. Generally, to my mind, when I think about community character, I think about how tall are the buildings? How close are they to the street? Where is the parking located? How large are the signs? How much landscaping is out there? What are the materials that the building is made out of? How far away is open space? How are we handling stormwater? What does it feel like to walk down the sidewalk in this place? Are there trees at the street or not? To me, those are kind of the currency of community character. And I think that,
Also, the underpinnings of economic development.
well, certainly, yes, absolutely.
I mean, look at downtown Greenville, South Carolina.
A great example, indeed. And so, you know, the Carrboro Connects is very clear about its goals and missions, right? You know, that we need to address, you know, affordable housing. We need to address climate action. We need to address race and equity. And you know, I think that those are all laudable goals that we need to work for and work toward. And I want to raise the question for you guys about whether or not, you know, community character is something that, you know, we need to have in the mix, you know, or not. And I mean, I think that's the guidance that we're seeking and that we're getting.
Thank you.
Councilmember Posada.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was not going to speak on these because I think my colleagues have already said quite enough on this, but I did want to just clarify, at least for my instance. So thank you, Councilmember Haven O'Donnell, for your question, because it does help me clarify this a little bit more. And I do think that we have to consider character as we're looking at this, but when I'm looking at this sheet, I'm looking at page 7 where all the pillars are at. When I see community character as a pillar, that for me is putting it equivalent to that of climate action, that of racial equity, that of attainable housing and predictable process for the entire thing. And that's where kind of my pushback comes in. I do think it's something that we need to keep in mind of, but by putting a pillar, for me, that's equating community character to race and equity, which, and many times, as Councilmember Frey said, can be contradictory and can be at opposite ends of the spectrum. And while I'm one of the people that love Carrboro for its quirkiness, that's how I moved here for work, and then I ended up staying just for the quirkiness of it and the community aspect of it. I don't think we want to get rid of that. But also, in my list of priorities, allowing for the people who make Carrboro that quirky, beautiful place to be able to stay here and have a sustainable climate that is going to allow them to continue to have a prosperous life and processes so that we can have development come in a way that is helpful for the town so that we're not relying so much on the folks who are landowners and homeowners, but can also diversify our modes of income are going to be important. So that's my only pushback here. When I'm looking at these four things, I can see those as incredibly important to this process, incredibly important to what we need to consider. And while I'm not trying to in any way, shape, or form dismiss community character, I do not see a community character as a pillar. I see it as something that we keep in mind, something that we talk about, something that we consider, but not a pillar. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Might be a drop the mic moment. Thank you for that, Councilmember Posada. Any other questions from anyone? Councilmember Frey.
Just one more thought here, Mr. Meadows, to to close, now that I've bit you. There's something that that I have been known to say sometimes, because I also moved to Carrboro because it was a quirky place. Carrboro is not its buildings, it's the people. So I would encourage you to not mistake the look of Carrboro for its character, insofar as we're considering that. I would also go back to something that you said a moment ago, that that when someone tells you, I want to live in a small town, and when someone tells you, I want to have an affordable place to live, that those two statements are equivalent. I do not believe that they are. Somebody's wish to live in a small town has to be weighed differently from someone's ability to afford a place to live. So when we're talking about the character of Carrboro, I just keep that in mind. That said, I want to close by noting that I really appreciate the fact that you've emphasized the trade-offs within and between these points. I hope that you'll continue to do that, and as we get deeper into this project, that you will be bringing us examples of concrete changes that could be made to move that slider in one direction or another, so that we can make good choices among them.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so looks like colleagues have gotten everything in. And I do just also want to add in about our Carrboro Connects comprehensive plan and everything that went into that plan, and how diverse and inclusive that work group was that came up with that plan, the task force. Matter of fact, I think Councilmember Frey was on that, and Posada. So I think, that was adopted a couple of years ago. I certainly look at it as a North Star for this process, and certainly see ways that it can be helpful for you. But I thought I might have heard you, is there some incompatibility there potentially as it relates to alignment with what we're trying to do by rewriting the land use ordinance? It is, guiding development and redevelopment for us for the next couple of decades. But this is, a new process, all right, for the most part. And certainly our Carrboro Connects comprehensive plan is aspirational. It's what community members want to see, what they say is important. Some of the community character is in that document, community values is in that document. And so I don't know, maybe I didn't hear you. Is there some incompatibility, or you expect some, or where do you see Carrboro Connect sitting? Because I see it sitting squarely in the middle of the rewrite of this land use ordinance. But you're the expert, so you tell me exactly, where it's going to be.
Right. So it's the foundation.
Yep.
And all things flow from Carrboro Connects. We do not want to open Carrboro Connects. We would beg you not to reopen Carrboro Connects. There is more than sufficient guidance there for us.
Okay.
It is normal and natural and what we would expect to see policy guidance that has areas of divergence, or areas that need to be prioritized or thought through and balanced. Pretty typical stuff. And, you know, that we wanted to draw that out for you and indicate that we're looking at that and we're thinking about how do we do these things that, you know, potentially could be at odds with one another, and how do we navigate that? I think it's legitimate, appropriate, in fact necessary to recognize that there are you know, distinctions or differences of opinion here, and that's you know, that's kind of our job to help you guys navigate that, and we're trying to set up and move in those directions so that we can have those discussions and talk about pros and cons and costs, and you know, get to the nuanced decision making that'll be part of your, you know, a part of your UDO. So short answer, don't change Carrboro Connects. We're very carefully following it, studying it, and making sure that we're implementing it, because it is the basis for what we're doing.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to just catch Town Manager Tony's attention real quick for the, I wanted to ask, since we have a slide here about attainable housing, and Mayor Pro Tem now had some comments. So we do have a work session coming up to talk about that, right? And so that's an opportunity also for us to maybe even bring some of what we're talking about tonight potentially into that space, right? And so that's a couple of months or so, maybe? Oh, March. Okay, I was thinking April. So thank you for that, Town Manager Tony. So I'm sure that will be helpful as well. And so I have a few questions. So I see the public forum where we're asking the people to come to Town Hall. Are there any listening sessions planned where we will go out into community? I know we did that for Carrboro Connects, if I'm not mistaken. We went out to a few places out in the community to, you know, to try to get some better outreach. It's early on, but that was just an ask, and you may already have it on your list.
Great question. And so I mentioned a series of public forums.
Yep.
You know, each and every one of those will have at least two sort of iterations. We've got a variety of what we're calling issue panels, which is where we're sort of bringing together people in the community to talk about attainable housing, race and equity, and climate action specifically, and focusing on those. We are thinking through how we best reach out and involve people in this. And create a space for people who want to be involved to be involved. And so, as you said, it is early in the process. We're still trying to figure out which are the groups that want to hear from us, and then how best do we manage you know, the interactions with them. Everybody on the team is dedicated to making sure that we hear from anybody who wants to talk to us, and that we make that process simple for people to be involved.
I appreciate that, and I think a concern of mine, and probably maybe others, is that we know that, you know, there are community members who are very engaged. They know what's happening. They're very attached to what we're doing.
Sure.
And so they know. But then there are others that are not so much so, but voices probably, for sure, need to be at the table and engage with this process, you know. And I always say, you know, folks don't receive news and information the same way, and so I think, you know, I'm thinking about some more non-traditional approaches, you know, to engagement, you know, to bring some folks around, maybe use some of our local community groups here, like the Jackson Center or El Centro Hispano, you know, the local NAACP chapter. I mean, there are groups that have broad reach, you know, and can get, you know, some folks around the table.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely, we agree.
The pocket questions, I don't know who did them. They were great. I did want to raise up a couple of things. So I know one thing was, it said it would be our job to ensure that the technical nature of development regulations, some requirements, and our zoning concepts will not be confusing for community members. And LUOs are just, they're confusing just in general. And, sometimes technical. And I appreciate that that was included in the pocket questions. And I don't know, if there's room. It seemed like I saw one of the slides about clarity, around the process, but it has to be a certain way, right, with certain language, but I know that we want that to be the case, but there's the technical nature of development regulations. So do you see any room there? And how would you try to create this higher level of clarity, for community members and folks who don't, kind of look at this stuff, every day or as we do as council members when we have it in front of us?
Sure. Great question. There's the easy low-hanging fruit that you always hear, things like use of plain English or avoiding terminology and jargon.
Right.
Absolutely is part of it. Being very clear with how we define terms and how we use language, very much part of it. Avoiding acronyms and so forth. Those are all important parts. As far as the deeper, more kinds of organic parts of this process, how we involve and incorporate people's participation in the consideration of development applications, we still need to talk about that because I think, yes, you're absolutely right. There are some state requirements for certain things. There are some latitude for some other things. And, it may well be that after consideration on balance, the community decides that, we want to avail ourselves of development review procedures that bring us certain outcomes, and that outcome is one that we're going to pursue, regardless of how it impacts participation. And it's not the greatest answer I've ever given, but it's something that we need to think about and register.
Right.
That certainly administrative review is fast. Certainly administrative review, particularly in instances where you've identified what you want, makes a lot of sense. At the same time, administrative review can interfere with people's ability to participate. And that's the reality. So we have to think through how we manage that and where are we willing to compromise and where are we not willing to compromise.
Right. I understand. Thanks. And the last thing, so in the pocket questions, I'm still there. So the root causes of inequities, they're right on point. And, I do want you to, kind of carry those, through the process so we don't stumble anywhere because, it was outlined really well. Whoever did the pocket questions did a great job. And great job on the presentation. Lots of good information. This first go round, and there'll be many more. So we appreciate it so much. Thank you.
So do we. Thank you so much. We really appreciate y'all's time and your great comments, and your direction. Very helpful. Thank
Anything
you.
else, council members, before he can sit down and get some water after about 2 hours? Everybody good? All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you.
This was the only item, council members, on our agenda, but I am now going to ask for a motion to go into closed session for item dealing with attorney-client privilege.
Madam Mayor, I'll happy to move that with the amendment of taking a 5-minute break between the two.
Oh, sure, while
Yes.
everybody clears the room.
All right, so I'll move that we move into closed session.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's been moved and properly seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. So we'll wait for folks to gather their belongings and leave, except for those that will be in the closed session. Take a little break.